And doing what matters is what matters to me. Doing what matters is why we are here. We are at a land-grant university to work with agriculture, to work with landowners, to improve food production, but also to minimize the environmental footprint of food production, of land use. We are the Aggies by heart. We do want to work with the agricultural sector to make it the best it can be.
Hi, I'm Joe Proudman, clearly not Tracy Sellers, here with Dr. Frank Mitloehner for our Clear Conversations podcast. Dr. Frank, Dr. Mitloehner, welcome to the podcast. You're no stranger. I've been a stranger for this podcast. But we're going to talk about methane today. I think you know a thing or two about methane.
My favorite topic.
So tell me a little bit about how long you've been studying this topic. How long has this been part of your career, your interests, and some of the things that you've accomplished during that time?
Well over 2 decades. I've always had an interest, and that's what I'm specialized in the impact of animal agriculture on air quality, on climate, and so on. And so for the last few decades, I have looked in particular into what kind of constituents that come from animal agriculture affecting air quality and or climate are out there, which ones are problematic, which ones need to be mitigated. And initially we always looked into typical air pollutants like ammonia and hydrogen sulfide, volatile organic compounds and so on. But then the focus shifted to climate pollutants. And here in particular methane, because that's the 800-pound gorilla. That's the most important climate pollutant from animal agriculture. And so that has been our specialty now for many years.
It's interesting you say like how your work has shifted as society has kind of shifted and their interest has shifted. Zooming into the climate discussion, how has that shifted during your time as you've been investigating it?
Well, methane is a different beast. Other air pollutants from animal agriculture, such as ammonia or so, they generated some interest by agencies. Volatile organic compounds definitely generated some interest because they are precursor, meaning a preform in the formation of smog, and that's a big topic here in California. In general, these topics are important because they all contribute to poor air. And boy, do we have poor air in California. In fact, in the Central Valley of California, where also most agricultural production in the entire US takes place, we unfortunately have the worst air quality in the country. So Fresno, here in the heart of the Central Valley, is the worst air quality designation in the country, followed by LA, followed by Houston, Texas. And that puts a bullseye onto animal agriculture because right where the air is bad, we have a lot of farms. And so some people, particularly those who are not very friendly towards animal agriculture, say, let's put one and one together, it must be the cows generating the emissions, okay? So I've studied that topic for a long time, and in particular volatile organic compounds, as I said, as a precursor of smog, but then also ammonia and other things. But then I found that over the last 10 years, the focus had shifted to methane. And it wasn't clear to me at first as to why that happened. But I think there was an effort by some groups who had an anti-livestock agenda as their mission to use methane as the vehicle to go after animal agriculture. That sounds like a tin hat kind of narrative, but I observed that over and over again, okay? That groups who had previously talked about animal welfare, animal housing, animal rights, animal behavior, and so on, they had then shifted all of a sudden to methane. And I believe from a scientific perspective, there ought to be a focus on methane because it's such an important gas. But it has been used to politicize the area, and that made it very controversial. And it shouldn't be that way. It should be a gas that we take very seriously because if we take it seriously and we manage it right, we can really make reductions of that gas into part of a climate solution, and we should. By politicizing it, we just get into a situation where we build up fronts, farmers against others. And we don't want that. It's not productive. It has gotten us to a position that's more difficult to get solutions done.
Yeah, it certainly has become, and has been for a long time, somewhat of a blame game, right? And so you have groups blaming producers who really just, think they're doing the right thing, they're doing a good job, they're producing food for a large population. Then all of a sudden they're getting blamed for doing that job. And to your point, it's created a situation where they've completely shut off from the conversation, right? And they feel attacked, and they're like, well, why would I be part of this if I was being attacked? Just for doing the job that society is broadly asking me to do. But going back even 10 years, I mean, what would be the conversations like talking to producers or other industry members about climate change? Was that a tough conversation to have?
It was an impossible conversation to have. 10 years ago, the topic of livestock and climate would have been a total no-go when discussing the impacts of animal agriculture on the environment. It was viewed as a vehicle of some political fraction to go after farmers. And it has taken me a long time to talk to farmers and ranchers about what's real, what their true impact is on climate, for them to listen and understand. And that's very important, because we need them to work on this topic and not ignore it, so that we move forward. But if you use the blame game, then you shut people down. If you were to be the father of a teenage son or daughter, and you just nag every day at them, will they listen to you when you do it once again, even though your intent might be a real valid one? No, they won't. You shut them down, and that's exactly what happened. So what we here at the Clear Center have done is the opposite. We want them to understand your industry has an impact on climate, and here's what that is. And the main gas is methane. And here are the different sources on your farm that contribute to it. But the great thing is, if you understand that, and if you can manage it, then you can reduce the impact food production has on warming. And that is what puts you into the seat of a player rather than just being the accused.
Yeah, and we've seen over these 10 years, at least the several years that I've been working in the center, that conversation shift not just from being somewhat proactive or positive to actually seeing some actionable items come into place. You've seen some organizations like the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef pop up. Another one's like producers actually looking for solutions here, right? And that's been a big change.
That has been a big change. For example, here at UC Davis, we now have, for the third time, soon the fourth time, organized a conference called the State of the Science Summit. And this conference attracts to our campus well over 350 stakeholders. Many of them are experts, some of them international experts, some of them policymakers, government members from 15 different countries, to come to this campus to learn about this gas, where it comes from, how much is emitted from various sources, how it can be mitigated without causing unintended consequences, okay? We don't want to reduce that gas and then initiate something else to go up or wrong in general. Let's say reduce methane but causing some animal welfare issues, or reduce methane and producing nitrous oxide, an even more powerful gas. It can absolutely happen. We have seen it happen. So these people come to our campus because we are considered a world leader doing research in this field, and here in particular, in the field of how to reduce this gas. We need to have farmers in the room, because if they don't buy into this, then nothing will happen. What some people do is just criticize farmers very loudly, make them look like the villain, and for those who do, they will never be able to claim to be part of any kind of solution. We, on the other hand, are proud of being part of it. Because in the state of California, our farmers are asked to do more than in other parts of the world. We have a law that mandates a 40% reduction of methane, 40, to be achieved by the year 2030, and that's around the corner. And because of the work we have done, not just we, but jointly done, farmers, agencies, the University of California and others, because of that work, we are now very well on track to reduce this gas in our animal agriculture sector by 40% on time. And you show me one other place in the world that has that track record. We are very proud of being part of that.
No, it's a great accomplishment, and that summit is a great event, with the partners with California Department of Food and Agriculture, Spark Climate Solutions, and the College of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences here at UC Davis. A very special event. But why is it important that we reduce methane, and what happens when we do?
As I said, methane is a very different kind of beast compared to other gases like CO2 or nitrous oxide or, let's say, ammonia or so. Insofar that it's not just produced by sources such as swamps or rice paddies or cowburbs. It's not just produced by various sources, but it's also naturally destroyed through a process called oxidation. To be precise, it's called hydroxyl oxidation. And that means there is a molecule in the air called a radical, a hydroxyl radical, and that radical destroys methane. And that happens in a relatively short time frame. So methane is produced by sources, but it's also destroyed by sinks. If we now reduce the sources, if we mitigate methane, then we replenish less methane than is naturally destroyed. And that means that our total methane is now going down. And when methane goes down, so does warming. So for our farmers who achieve a 20, 30, 40% methane reduction, what happens when they do that is that the methane concentrations go down and so does the warming. And that is why it's so important that we get the methane story right. It's not a question of politics. It's one of physics and chemistry. It's one of science, and it's one of working with those people who have some control over deciding whether it goes this way or that way. If it goes up, we have a very detrimental impact on warming. Much worse than, let's say, CO2. But if it goes down, then we have a very positive and short-term impact on warming. And that's where we want to go.
So can you talk a little bit about how we measure the impact of methane, whether it's going up or down?
Yeah, this is one of the really difficult parts of this discussion, okay? So years ago, back in the 1990s, policymakers wanted to get a better handle of how these different greenhouse gases warm the planet. They wanted to have a number or a unit, or we actually call it a metric, that shows how methane and other greenhouse gases like nitrous oxide, how they compare to a known gas such as CO2. And these policymakers asked, is there any kind of factor or so that we could use to show how a certain amount of methane compares to a certain amount of CO2? And scientists actually provided that metric. It's called GWP100. It stands for Global Warming Potential over 100 years. For methane, it means that one molecule of methane is approximately 28 times more powerful than one molecule of CO2. And that metric then enabled policymakers to say, okay, if an industry produces 1,000 tons of methane, all we need to do is multiply that 1,000 tons of methane times this factor 28, and then we have what's called a CO2 equivalent amount of this gas, CO2e. And this metric, GWP100, converted the methane into carbon equivalents, these so-called CO2e units. It was simple, but those scientists used caveats, and they said, look, there are 20 footnotes underneath our table. Make sure you consider the footnotes, but guess what? The footnotes were cut off and nobody cared. Because the caveats were in there for a reason. Why? because CO2 is produced by various sources, but it's not naturally destroyed. Methane is. In other words, the way that methane warms the planet, or the behavior of methane, is different compared to the behavior of CO2. It's not simply 28 times more potent than CO2, but it has this specialty to it of not just being produced but also destroyed. And as a result, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, IPCC, put out several paragraphs in their so-called AR6 report cautioning about the use of GWP 100, that very metric the world has been using for decades. The IPCC said that if you use GWP 100 for a given source, then you might exaggerate the impact of methane on warming by a factor of 3 to 4. And that's true particularly if you reduce methane, okay? If you increase methane by a different source, then you underestimate the impact of this gas on warming. So if you reduce this gas, then you overestimate the impact of this gas on warming. And if you do the opposite, then you underestimate the impact of this gas on warming. In either direction, you're wrong. Okay? So, and in this context, I then say, look, we are interested in reducing this gas. As I said, here in California, we have a law, SB 1383, that mandates a 40% reduction of this gas. Our farmers are asking, if we were to achieve that, what would that do on warming? So now some of my colleagues say, well, we should just use GWP 100 and say what it does to CO2 equivalent units. But guess what? That is not the question people ask. They don't want to know how much carbon equivalent units are reduced. They want to know, what does a reduction of this gas that I might cause through my action, what does that do to actual warming? Will it be helping? Will it be hurting? Will it do nothing? And for that, GWP 100 is absolutely useless. It will not answer the question of how methane warms the planet. But that's what it's all about. And because of that, we need a metric that's fit for purpose to describe actual warming. And that's why what our colleagues at Oxford University came up with, GWP star, really got my interest, because they said, it's all about the warming. Why don't we use a metric that describes that?
Do you remember when you kind of, came upon GWP star and what some of your first thoughts were with it?
I do remember it well. I studied a colleague of mine, Professor Miles Allen is his name, a former chairman of the IPCC, and he has a career in this field as a physicist, as a climatologist, and he made it his career to not just study the physics and so on around this gas, but also the means to show the impact it has on actual warming. And he was the one who started changing some of the calculations of this gas on actual warming, insofar that he wanted to account for the rate of change over time. Why is that important? Rate of change over time. That's a mouthful. What does it mean? It means that if you, over a certain period of time, 20, 30 years or so, if you decrease that gas, let's say from 100 to 80 or to 60, what would that do to actual warming? Or if you go from the 100 to 120 or 140, what would that do to warming? And so on the basis of GWP 100, he used that very metric of GWP 100 and put in some correction factors that account for the short lifespan of this gas. And by using these correction factors of GWP 100 in his formula for GWP star, he showed what the dramatic impacts are if you manage it, if you reduce it, or if you ignore it and you increase it. And that's what I had been waiting for. A metric that is fit for purpose to show the effects of this gas on warming. Because I want to tell the farmers who ask me, what those 30% or so emission reductions they achieve, what that does to warming. And GWP star helped me do that. What Miles Allen explained, and very eloquently so, was that if you reduce 0.3%, 0.3%, doesn't sound like very much. If you reduce 0.3% of this gas per year, then you are in balance of producing versus that gas being destroyed. And that means you're not adding additional warming to our planet. Additional warming to our planet. So if you reduce this gas by 0.3% per year, you're not adding additional warming to our planet. Why is that meaningful? It's meaningful because agreements like the Paris Climate Accord are asking humanity not to exceed additional warming beyond 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade. That's what that Paris Climate Accord is about. Not to add additional warming beyond 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade. So what would that then apply to agriculture mean? What would we need to do in animal agriculture to not cause additional warming? And I'm not going to 1.5 to 2 degrees. I'm just saying no additional warming. And here the answer is 0.3% reduction per year will get us to no additional warming. What if we achieve 0.5% or 1% reduction per year? Then more methane is naturally destroyed than we replenish. And that means methane is going down, warming is going down. We can undo some of the historical contributions of the sector by reducing methane. How exciting is that? And I have seen for the first time, Joe, farmers being excited about being part of a solution. And that has never been greenwashing. It has never been creative accounting. It has been a story rooted in science, in physics and chemistry.
No, and it's a great story, one that I think that can be replicated even across other sectors. Given that GWP Star has a lot of validity behind it, given who helped create it, who's continuing that work, and what it shows, why do you think it's generated some controversy in certain circles?
It generates controversy because it gives the same people who had been critical of animal agriculture for releasing methane, and those people really felt methane was the Achilles heel that they had to go after in order to put animal agriculture out of business. It makes these people worried that this angle might get lost. And that's the activists. I'm not really spending or wasting my time on the activists now, okay? Let's just go to the scientists in the field who are critical of this approach. Some of the scientists think that by discussing the contributions of livestock to climate using a metric like GWP star will get them out of jail free. Will make them think, look, if we reduce methane by a little bit, then we are out of the discussion, okay? It's no longer a big deal. So we can move on to other topics. But that's not true. GWP star is not a get out of jail free card. GWP star will make you look good if you reduce methane because it accurately shows what happens to the actual warming. If you increase methane, it makes you look 3 to 4 times worse than GWP 100. And let's be very clear, in many parts of the world, methane is not going down. Also not in animal agriculture going down, but up. And if you use GWP star under those situations, then you will find what a powerful gas this is. We have to get it right. This is not a question of being on this side or that side of the political aisle. It's a question of making correct policy decisions that help us get to the climate results that we seek. That's what it's about. I have not seen people say, I criticize GWP star because I think it's scientifically invalid. I have never once heard that. I have heard some people say there are questions of fairness around using GWP star. Let me explain because now it becomes really complicated, okay? So let's say you were a farmer and you have been in farming. Let's say you had 1,000 cows for the last 40 years. And you have reduced 10% of methane, let's say, over the last few years. Then that reduction of methane from your 1,000 cows when using GWP star will make you look good. It will make you look like you have not caused additional warming, therefore you're doing your job. Great. If now another farmer comes who has never done farming and says, I want to buy 100 cows and start a new farm, then that guy goes from 0 cows to 100 cows, and these 100 cows, of course, will produce way more methane than what he had before, which was nothing, right? And that new amount of methane, when using GWP star, will make him look very bad. Even though he produces much fewer methane than the other guy with 1,000 cows, because he has now gone from 0 to 100, GWP star will make him look very bad. And so people saying there's a fairness issue will say it depends on what your baseline was 20 years ago. Whether you were at one stage or another will determine how good you look now. So, but that is not a scientific question. That's a political question. Fairness is not a scientific question, it's a political question. I'll give you an analogy, because I love analogies, okay? Let's say you were a millionaire and I'm not. I'm a low-income guy, and we both drive a car. And we both violate the speed limit. Instead of driving 60, you drive 80 and I drive 80. We both get a ticket. You will have to pay $300 and I will have to pay $300. But you are this rich guy, and you will not feel the $300, $400 penalty. I will really feel it, because it might be a third of my income check. Now, you could very validly so say, this is unfair. Why does the rich guy have to pay, why does he have to pay the same amount as the poor guy? He should be paying way more so that he feels it just as badly as the poor guy. Now, you see where I'm coming from here. You can have these fairness discussions in all kinds of societal venues. But that's not a question of science, as I said. This is a question of politics and how we deal with fairness across all aspects. In the case of animal agriculture and how it warms the planet, the first and foremost question should be, what do we need to do to reduce emissions? What's working, what's not? And what are the real impacts of these actions on warming? And that is the metrics we should use. That doesn't mean that I love metrics. I don't even like metrics in general, neither GWP 100, nor GWP 20, which make things even worse, nor GWP star. I just say GWP star, if you use a metric, is the least damaging thing. What I am proposing is that we don't use a metric at all, that we account separately for each gas. For CO2 separately from methane, separately from nitrous oxide, because these gases are so different in how they behave in warming the planet. That would be the cleanest way of doing it. New Zealand is doing it, other countries throughout the world are contemplating it. I think we should do it everywhere, because that's a fair way of assessing this gas.
So tell me a little bit about, how does a professor from California get into the middle of this conversation? And in some ways, not in a good way. In some ways, some very good ways in the middle of this conversation. But how did you find yourself in this space?
So, when people think of California, people from outside of California, when they think of California, they think of Silicon Valley, they think of Hollywood. But the backbone of the state is really agriculture. We're producing 50% of the nation's fruits and vegetables, 90% of the nation's nuts, 20% of the nation's dairy products. The area between Sacramento and Bakersfield, the so-called San Joaquin Valley of California, is some of the most productive agricultural land in the world. And it's also home to the most dairy cows in the nation. We're producing, as I said, 20% of all dairy products. And we have a very unique environment here. We have mountain ranges on both sides of the valley, trapping air pollution that's generated in the valley. So we have water issues there, we have air issues, we do produce climate pollutants. So it's clear that we have environmental challenges, many of which are caused by being home to 10% of all Americans in this state. But some of that contribution to poor air, water, and so on is also originating in agriculture. And we know that there are contributions, positive and negative, that our sector has on the environment. So I was hired over 2 decades ago to join the animal science department as an air quality specialist to study the air impacts of livestock in a place like California and finding ways to reducing those contributions. So everything in this state here is political, okay? I mean, I can think of very few things that are not political here. Studying the impact of animal agriculture on the environment is certainly no exception to that. And we are 50 miles or so away from San Francisco. We are 20 miles away from the capital, Sacramento. We are surrounded by agricultural stakeholders. It is just by nature a very political environment here. And what happens in this country always first happens here in California. And so UC Davis is generally considered a world leader in agriculture and environmental sciences. When you believe in the statistics ranking institutions throughout the world, we routinely pop up as the leading one. And when scientists on this campus publish work that is in areas that is controversial, for example, methane from livestock, then it automatically generates attention by the media, by policymakers, attention from all kinds of interested parties. And what has made me different from most others is that I understand the necessity of breaking down a lot of this very technical stuff into ways that the people who need to know understand. Now that sounds trivial to say, but it's not. Many of my colleagues do not do this. They try to be as technically accurate and so on, as specific in how they word everything, in ways that a farmer or a normal land user or so would not understand because they don't use that terminology frequently. I am very much aware that if the people who I seek to influence to change management of the enterprises, if they don't understand what I'm saying, then what I do has no impact. And doing what matters is what matters to me. Doing what matters is why we are here. We are at a land-grant university. We were established as a system of land-grant campuses throughout the country to work with agriculture, to work with landowners, to improve food production. That's where land-grant universities came from. But also to minimize the environmental footprint of food production, of land use of different kind. And I take that charge, I take that mission very serious and very personal. And I'm proud of this. We are the Aggies. UC Davis we are called the Aggies, and we are the Aggies by heart. We do want to work with the agricultural sector to make it the best it can be. And so I will never get old of doing it. I'm proud of it, and I'm proud of having earned the trust of that sector and of so many people who cherish what that sector is producing for all of us day in, day out.
Yeah. No, it always amazes me how often it's thrown out as a negative that the Clear Center works with agriculture. And I grew up in an agricultural region. Look out my window and see cows or different crops and such like that. And it always seemed like a very honorable thing to do, right? Providing food for people, and it being, I'm gonna take something that you've said in the past, being one of 2 critical industries for our society, agriculture, health being another one. What is it? What do you see here at the Clear Center? What are you doing here at the Clear Center that it is contributing to agriculture, helping improve agriculture? Where's that mark that you see the Clear Center leaving? Whether that's specific trials or studies, or even your comms, your communications work.
So before I come to the second part of your question, I want to ask you something related to the first part of it, which was, you said, that's what we've often discussed, there are 2 strategically important sectors of society: health and food. If I were to say there are people who criticize doctors or people who study pharmaceuticals or so, who say that that's a bad sector, a bad player, and that we should be critical of the health sector. I don't think that there would be any any support for that, right? This is a sector everybody cherishes and holds dear, nurses, doctors, and so forth. But I think that the people growing the food are every bit as important as those providing our health. And we must not forget that every bite we all put in our mouths every day was grown on some field by somebody out there, okay? By some farmer and their workers doing this every day. So they deserve a treatment that is at least that of our health sector. So for people who think a scientist, an agricultural scientist, I might add, working with agriculture does something somewhat nefarious, somewhat negative by working with the sector, does not understand where the food that we all consume, where it comes from. And that very sector, the agricultural sector, is in as much need of support as the health sector. We have a big job to do here, okay? We have a big job to do. We have to feed 3 times more people in our lifetime, 3 times more, from 3 billion when we were young to 9 billion when we are old. And we must do that without depleting our natural resources. I don't really care of people saying, look at this, a scientist working with agriculture. That is in my job description, and I'm proud of doing it.
Yeah, people certainly take for granted the food, how the food gets to their plate, that it is available. I mean, and there is, realities. There is food insecurity, even in this country, even on this campus, and such like that. But yet it's still taken for granted, So, no, it really, really is an interesting conversation, though, that there are large parts of society that don't value agriculture as much as maybe it deserves.
Joe, for the longest time, people spend about 6% of their disposable income on food. They took food for granted. It was cheap. We had a cheap food policy in this country for a long time. We just consumed anything we wanted. We didn't really care much about the quality of it. Just it had to be yummy, right? Yeah. And it shows. If you look at the population, many people are not very healthy. Because they have not really spent the time on food that they should have. Food is such an important topic. It's not one of politics. It should be one we celebrate. Okay, we should celebrate food. We should educate our kids on food. We should educate them on how food affects their lives. Not just their taste buds, but also their health and the environment and so on. And I have found that it's very rewarding for me to be part of that discussion. It's very rewarding for me to explain this sector to the society at large. And those who listen, whether it's chefs or nutritionists, high school students or judges, all of which are audiences I frequently talk to. Once you do talk to them, you can see a light bulb going on. You can see a light bulb going on and an appreciation for reaching out and understanding better a sector that they never really thought of before.
Yeah. No, it's amazing actually. You talk to these different groups, and I've been fortunate enough to sit in some of your discussions, how much they learn. You think people know about food, or they have some basic understandings of it, and you realize that there is a large knowledge gap there. And I think that's one thing that we've been able to do here at the Clear Center is fill some of those knowledge gaps that are out there, particularly when it comes to animal agriculture. I mean, what are some of those other things that we're doing here in the center that you think are noteworthy, that are valuable, that are actually making a difference, that'll make an impact?
So most of the research we do here is funded through public sources by the state of California or even the federal government. And it is on mitigating some of the unwanted consequences of producing food, okay? Environmental impacts, let's say. And we are studying ways of reducing, let's say, emissions, for example, methane or ammonia or other things. Or we are studying improvements of animal welfare, better animal handling, fewer impacts on human exposures to pollutants and so on, in ways that are meaningful to the real world. What we study is not just some biogeochemical process, even though we do that too, but we want to know what could work in the real world that would be implemented, because only then it makes sense. If nobody uses what you find, what you research, then you might get a peer-reviewed paper out of it, but it ends there. And we don't have the time to do work on stuff that ends on a bookshelf. We need to get our knowledge into practice in order to have a real-world impact on emissions, on animal welfare, on worker health and safety, and so on. And we are that entity that does it. And it fills me with joy and pride to be leading that effort.
As you look forward, considering that the work that you've done, the work that we're doing in the center, what is it that excites you, about working with, the sustainability space at the intersection of animal agriculture as you look down the road, maybe 2 to 3 years, 5 years even?
What excites me tremendously is that I get invited by veterinarians, by physicians, by renderers, by cattle producers, poultry producers, by health professionals, and so forth, to explain to them how what we study, how that works, why it matters, how we can be part of a solution. And what excites me is to see that what we do here 5 or 10 years later ends up in the real world. For example, 10 years ago, I found that some of the feed we feed to cattle, before we feed it to cattle, is one of the main emission sources from a dairy. And that was unknown before. And when we found it, there were people who were up in arms in farming saying, oh my gosh, look what you found now. That gets us all into trouble. Now 5 and 10 years later, that very research we did back then has changed the way we produce that feed, we store that feed, we feed that feed to cattle, and it has had a significant impact on the bottom line of the farmer. They're saving money. It has had an impact on animal health and welfare because it's better feed, and we have had a significantly lower environmental impact. And that is really what gets me excited. If research that we have done here in the ivory tower doesn't stay in the ivory tower, but it makes it on the farms. When all of a sudden people who said, well, yeah, we might see cattle enjoying shade, but do we really need it? Well, we studied it and we found out how to build those shades and what the importance of providing shade is on cattle welfare. And now I don't see a single cow in this state unshaded. And that fills me with pride. Yes, it does. I mean, you might say it's not that important, not you, but our listeners, but it is. It is important. We have improved the lives of people. We have improved the lives of the animals they have custody over. We have improved the quality of the environment on these farms, and it makes us proud. And we will continue to doing so forever.
Yeah. Well, you got me really riled up, motivated to keep going. That's all we got for today on our podcast, Clear Conversations. Please subscribe. We're going to try to put these out pretty regularly for you all to listen. Of course, Dr. Mitloehner will be on these podcasts as much as we can, as much as you're home and around and available for these. It's always great to chat with you. And we thank you very much.